Big Shaq was enjoying his meal when the restaurant manager sneered at a black priest. "We don't serve your kind here." The room went silent. Forks froze midair. A few diners exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. Shaq exhaled slowly, setting down his drink. He wasn't just going to call out the injustice. He was about to flip the entire script. What happened next didn't just humble the manager, it changed the restaurant's fate forever. Stay till the end, because this isn't just about revenge. It's about a lesson no one saw coming. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The soft hum of classical music filled the air as well-dressed patrons sipped wine and dined beneath golden chandeliers. The restaurant, La Maison, prided itself on exclusivity, where only the city's elite came to eat. Tonight, it was business as usual, until the door opened. Father James stepped inside, the warmth of the restaurant immediately contrasting with the chilly night outside. His tailored navy blue suit was crisp, his clerical collar neatly in place, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He wasn't here for trouble, just a meal after a long day of serving the community. A young hostess, Lisa, barely out of her teens, glanced up from her podium and offered a hesitant smile. "Good evening, sir. Table for one?" Before Father James could answer, another voice sliced through the air. "Lisa, I'll handle this." A tall, heavy-set man in a too-tight dress shirt and an arrogance that filled the room stepped forward. Richard, the manager. His smirk was slight, but his eyes, cold and calculating, made Father James's skin crawl. "We have a strict dress code," Richard said, his voice loud enough for nearby diners to hear. "No, casual wear." Father James frowned, glancing down at himself. His suit was sharper than half the men in this room. "I believe I'm dressed just fine," he replied, keeping his voice measured. Richard stepped in closer, lowering his tone just enough to make it clear who was in control. "This isn't the place for people like you." Silence. The conversation may have been whispered, but the weight of Richard's words hit like a hammer. A few nearby diners shifted uncomfortably, pretending to be lost in their plates. Others simply looked away. No one said a word. Father James felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't the first time he'd faced discrimination, but that didn't make it hurt any less. Slowly he exhaled, gripping the cross that hung beneath his collar. Then before he could turn to leave, a deep voice boomed from across the restaurant. "Nah, we're not doing this today." A hush fell over the room. Chairs scraped against the floor as heads turned toward the back corner. There, unfolding his massive frame from a booth, stood Big Shaq. Arms crossed, eyes locked on Richard, expression deadly serious. Every diner held their breath as Shaq stepped forward. Richard had no idea what was coming next. A tense, uncomfortable silence filled the restaurant as Shaq slowly rose to his feet. The wooden chair groaned beneath his weight as he pushed it back, his towering 7 feet 1 inch frame casting a shadow over the room. The once elegant atmosphere of La Maison suddenly felt suffocating. The clinking of silverware stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes locked onto the giant standing at the back. Richard, who had moments ago been so smug, tensed visibly as Shaq took a step forward. "You want to say that again?" Shaq's voice wasn't loud, but it carried a low, commanding rumble that sent a chill through the air. Richard swallowed hard, his smirk faltering for the first time. I was just enforcing policy," he stammered, gripping the podium as if it might keep him from collapsing under the pressure. Shaq arched an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "So the policy is no black priests allowed?" A few gasps escaped from the nearby tables. Someone coughed. A waiter froze mid-step. Lisa, the young hostess, stared down at her shoes, clearly uncomfortable. A couple near the entrance exchanged nervous glances but remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke up. Richard forced a chuckle, straightening his tie like he still had control. "Sir, please don't make this into something it's not. This is a fine dining establishment. We have standards." Shaq took another step forward, his presence now suffocating. "Standards," he repeated, his deep voice dripping with disbelief. He slowly looked Richard up and down as if measuring him. "You mean like treating every customer with respect? Or just the ones that look like you?" Richard's face flushed red. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Shaq let out a slow, dangerous chuckle, the kind that made Richard's confidence shrink on the spot. He turned, scanning the restaurant. People refused to meet his gaze. Some shifted awkwardly in their seats, pretending they hadn't just witnessed blatant discrimination. Shaq nodded to him. Self, then turned back to Richard. His expression hardened. So y'all just gonna sit there and pretend you didn't hear that? The restaurant remained frozen, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Would anyone have the guts to speak up? Or was Shaq about to handle this himself? A heavy silence hung over the restaurant like a thick fog. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. The once lively chatter had been replaced with an awkward, almost eerie stillness. People looked anywhere but at Shaq and Richard. A well-dressed couple near the bar exchanged a nervous glance. The woman, gripping the stem of her wine glass, leaned in and whispered, "Just let it go. It's not worth it." Across the room, a man in a business suit cleared his throat and suddenly found his menu fascinating. A waiter near the kitchen gripped his tray, looking like he wanted to step in, but he didn't. Shaq let his gaze sweep across the restaurant. The silence told him everything he needed to know. He nodded slowly, lips pressing together in disappointment. "So y'all cool with this?" His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. "Good to know." Lisa, the hostess, shifted uncomfortably, her hands trembling as she held the seating chart. It was clear she wasn't okay with what was happening, but she was too scared to speak up. Richard, sensing the shift in Shaq's demeanor, tried to reclaim control. He straightened his tie, forcing another smirk. "Look, big guy, I don't know what you think you're proving here, but this is just business. If you don't like it, you're free to leave." Shaq slowly turned back to him, his towering presence making the air feel heavier. "Nah," Shaq said, voice low and calm. "I think I'll stay." Richard rolled his eyes. "Then what are you gonna do? Keep standing there, trying to scare me?" Shaq chuckled, a slow, deliberate laugh that sent a chill down Richard's spine. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "All right, I'm gonna make a call." Richard's smirk flickered. "A call? To who?" Shaq tapped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. "Hope you got good lawyers, bro." Richard's confidence cracked as Shaq calmly waited for the call to connect. The restaurant held its breath. Who was he calling? And how bad was this about to get? The moment Shaq raised his phone to his ear, the atmosphere inside the restaurant changed completely. The soft hum of quiet conversations had already faded, but now an even heavier silence settled over the room. Eyes darted toward the towering figure of Shaq, their curiosity battling with the unease of witnessing something they knew was about to escalate. The tension was so thick, it felt like the entire place was holding its breath. Richard, who had been so smug just moments ago, suddenly looked far less sure of himself. His fingers gripped the edges of the podium, as if it might somehow anchor him in place. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat as he forced a smirk, but his shifting stance betrayed him. Shaq, still calm, turned slightly and held up a hand. It wasn't an aggressive motion, but it carried authority, a silent demand that Richard stop talking. Then, without another word, Shaq pressed a button on his phone and lifted it to his ear. "Yeah, it's me," he said, his deep voice steady and deliberate. "I need you to pull up something for me." Richard scoffed, trying to mask his nerves with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Oh, please," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Who do you think you're calling?" "The president." Shaq didn't respond. He just watched Richard with calm amusement, his fingers casually tapping against the back of his phone as he waited. A few tables away, a woman leaned into her husband, whispering, "Who do you think he's actually calling?" Then through the speaker, a voice rang out, sharp, authoritative, and instantly recognizable. "Shaq, this is Ronald Hughes, CEO of La Maison Group. What's going on?" The color drained from Richard's face. The restaurant's CEO? People in the dining area sat up a little straighter, suddenly invested in what was unfolding before them. A couple of waiters standing near the kitchen exchanged glances, their expressions filled with silent shock. Shaq smirked, tilting his head slightly as he took in Richard's sudden discomfort. "Oh, now you want to talk?" Richard's mouth opened, then closed again. The false bravado that had been holding him together began to crumble right in front of everyone. He let out an awkward chuckle, though it sounded more like a wheeze. "Wait, you actually know Mr. Hughes?" His voice had lost its earlier arrogance, replaced by something closer to disbelief. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, I own 5 businesses bigger than this. You really thought I wouldn't have connections?" Lisa, the hostess who had been caught in the middle of this whole ordeal, let out a small gasp. The weight of the situation was sinking in for everyone now, not just Richard. Nazaranayi. Corner table, a man in a navy blazer leaned forward, muttering under his breath, This just got interesting. On the other end of the call, Hughes's tone darkened. Shaq, talk to me. What's happening? Shaq didn't break eye contact with Richard as he spoke. I'm standing in your restaurant, watching your manager refuse service to a black priest. Thought you'd want to know. The silence that followed was deadly. And then, the explosion. He did what? The CEO's voice boomed through the phone speaker, so loud that even diners on the far end of the restaurant turned their heads. Lisa flinched. A busboy near the kitchen nearly dropped a tray. Even a couple of guests who had been trying to ignore the confrontation visibly recoiled. Richard looked like he had been physically struck. His lips parted, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. His breath came faster, more uneven. Wait, this is being taken out of context. His voice cracked slightly, a desperate attempt to reclaim control over a situation that was rapidly slipping through his fingers. Shaq raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Oh? Then you won't mind if I put you on speaker. As Shaq's thumb hovered over the speaker button, the entire restaurant seemed to lean in, waiting. The weight of Richard's actions was crashing down, and in mere moments, his fate would be sealed. The voice on the other end of the line was booming with rage, cutting through the tense silence of the restaurant like a knife. What did you just do? Ronald Hughes, CEO of La Maison Group, sounded like he was about to explode. The sheer volume of his voice, amplified by the phone speaker, made several guests at nearby tables flinch. A waiter carrying a tray of drinks paused mid-step, eyes widening as he took in the unfolding chaos. Richard visibly paled. Beads of sweat formed at his temple as he scrambled for words, his usual smug arrogance completely wiped away. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, struggling to come up with an excuse that wouldn't dig his grave even deeper. It was just a misunderstanding, he finally blurted out, his voice uneven, almost pleading. He gestured weakly at Father James. He wasn't following policy. We have a strict dress code, and Shaq let out a slow, deliberate chuckle, shaking his head. He tilted his head slightly, the look in his eyes unreadable, but one thing was clear. He wasn't buying a single word Richard was saying. Misunderstanding, Shaq repeated, his deep voice carrying through the room with a dangerous calmness. He took a small step forward, towering even more over Richard, who visibly shrank back. All right, cool, Shaq continued, his tone almost casual. Since you're so sure this was all a big misunderstanding, let's roll the footage. The words hit Richard like a brick. His entire body tensed, his breathing became shallow, and for the first time, real panic flickered across his face. Lisa, the young hostess, visibly perked up. A spark of something, relief, maybe even satisfaction, flashed across her face as she turned to Shaq. There are security cameras all over the restaurant, she said quickly. They record everything. Richard spun toward her. Lisa, that's... He stopped himself, realizing he had no way out. Shaq pulled out his phone again. Let's call the security team. I'd love to see how this misunderstanding plays out on camera. Richard's entire body went rigid as the realization sank in. Every word, every sneer, every racist remark was caught on tape. His fate wasn't just sealed, it was about to be broadcasted for everyone to see. The dim glow of a phone screen flickered under a table as one of the waiters tapped upload. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. The video was out. Every insult, every sneer, every second of Richard's humiliation of Father James, captured in crisp detail. Less than 10 minutes later, a storm was brewing online. The first comment hit almost immediately. This is disgusting. Is this really happening in 2025? Then another. Boycott this restaurant. Fire that manager. Now a flood of tweets followed, the outrage spreading like wildfire. Boycott. This restaurant was trending nationwide within an hour. News stations picked up the footage, flashing Richard's smug face across TV screens. Social media exploded. TikTok videos dissected every frame. Twitter threads demanded justice. Facebook posts urged people to leave one-star reviews on every platform they could find. Shaq leaned back in his chair, watching the chaos unfold on his phone screen. His expression? Completely unreadable. Across the restaurant, Richard's phone buzzed violently on the hostess stand. At first, he ignored it, still too shaken from Shaq's confrontation. Then another buzz. And another. A relentless stream of notifications. He finally snatched the phone, his eyes darting over the screen. His stomach dropped. Richard, have you seen Twitter? one of the waiters muttered. His hand trembled as he tapped open the app. Hundreds, no, thousands of people were calling for his immediate firing. News stations were tagging the restaurant's official account, demanding a response. The video had already hit over 1 million views. Richard staggered back. His entire career, his entire reputation was unraveling in real time. Across the room, a customer gasped, staring at her phone. They just suspended the restaurant's website. Another whispered, their Yelp page is getting destroyed. The weight of what was happening crashed down on Richard all at once. His face turned pale. Then, his phone rang. Richard's grip on the device tightened as the screen flashed a name that sent ice down his spine. The CEO was calling. The sleek black Mercedes-Benz pulled up in front of the restaurant, its tinted windows concealing the powerful figure inside. The tires hadn't even stopped rolling before the driver's side door flew open, and out stepped a sharply dressed man in a navy blue suit. The CEO himself. His face was stone cold, his movements purposeful as he strode toward the entrance. Inside, Richard was pacing near the hostess stand, his face drenched in sweat. He had barely processed the online firestorm when an urgent text came from corporate. Stay put, CEO is on his way. Now as the front door swung open, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The CEO locked eyes with Richard from across the dining room, and in that moment, Richard felt the air leave his lungs. This was it. Shaq, still seated near Father James, leaned back in his chair, watching with interest. Other customers whispered amongst themselves, some secretly recording. The CEO didn't even slow down as he approached Richard. Keys, name tag, now! Richard's hands froze midair. Sir, wait, Now! The sharpness in his voice cut through the room like a blade. Richard fumbled with his name tag, his fingers clumsy and shaking. His once cocky smirk was gone, replaced by raw panic. But, Richard stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, I was just following policy. The CEO let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. He leaned in slightly, his expression filled with nothing but disgust. We just changed the policy. And guess what? You're out. The entire restaurant erupted in whispers as Richard stood frozen, the weight of his downfall crashing down on him. His hands clenched into fists, but it was too late. The empire he thought he controlled, gone. The moment Richard stumbled out of the restaurant, the weight of his downfall dragging behind him like chains, the entire room felt lighter, like a dark cloud had been lifted. But while the former manager was gone, Shaq wasn't finished just yet. He turned to Father James, who was still standing near the host stand, his fingers gripping the back of a chair as if trying to steady himself. His tailored suit, once crisp, seemed to carry the weight of humiliation. Shaq wasn't about to let him leave feeling that way. With a warm smile, Shaq extended a massive hand. Come on, Father. You still hungry? Let's eat. The priest blinked in surprise. You sure, son? I wouldn't want to cause more trouble. Shaq chuckled. Trouble's already been served, hot and fresh. Now let's get you a real meal. The CEO, still visibly rattled from the firestorm unfolding around his brand, jumped at the opportunity to smooth things over. He wiped his brow and forced a nervous smile. Absolutely, it's on the house. Anything you want. The staff, now eager to distance themselves from Richard's disgrace, rushed into motion. A waiter practically sprinted to grab menus, while the chef peeked from the kitchen, awaiting further instructions. But Shaq didn't sit down. He didn't even glance at the menu. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest, towering over the CEO with a look of deep contemplation. Then he smirked. Actually, man, I got a better idea. The CEO frowned, unsure of what that meant. Sure. What is it? Shaq stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until he was standing right in front of the man. Then, in a voice just loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear, he asked, How much does this place cost? The entire restaurant went dead silent. The CEO's eyes widened in pure shock, his jaw slightly dropping as if he had just been punched in the gut. The murmurs among the diners turned into a stunned hush. Even Father James looked up in disbelief. Was Shaq really about to buy the entire restaurant? The moment Shaq's words left his mouth, the restaurant seemed to freeze in time. Conversations halted, forks stopped clinking against plates, and all eyes were locked onto the 7-foot legend towering over the CEO. The CEO's jaw hung slightly open, his mind scrambling to process what he had just heard. You want to buy this place? He stammered, blinking rapidly as if he had misheard. Shaq simply tilted his head. a smirk playing on his lips. That's what I said. Name your price. The CEO hesitated, glancing around the restaurant as if expecting someone to intervene, but no one did. His face was already drenched in sweat, knowing that his entire company was on the verge of PR disaster. His phone had been buzzing nonstop ever since Shaq's video went viral, and the backlash was already spreading like wildfire. He swallowed hard. Shaq, listen, I don't think you understand how complicated these things are. This isn't just about money, it's... Shaq didn't let him finish. With one smooth motion, he pulled out his phone, tapped his banking app, and turned the screen around. The CEO's eyes widened at the number displayed on Shaq's account. You were saying, Shaq asked, voice calm but firm. A waiter gasped audibly. A couple sitting nearby exchanged stunned glances. Even Father James raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. The CEO's fingers twitched as he tried to compose himself. I'd have to call my corporate partners. Shaq leaned in slightly, his presence alone making the man shrink back. Then call them, right now. With shaky hands, the CEO yanked out his phone and dialed a number. As the conversation played out, it became clear that corporate was desperate to get out of this mess. The public outrage was already tanking their reputation, and selling the restaurant to someone like Shaq? That was a golden exit. After what felt like an eternity, the CEO finally let out a deep sigh, running a hand down his face. All right, it's yours. We'll draw up the paperwork immediately. Shaq clapped his hands together and grinned. Now that's what I like to hear. As the reality of the moment settled in, Shaq turned to Father James, his expression serious but full of purpose. Now the real question is, you ready to run this place with me? The morning sun cast a golden glow over the newly renovated restaurant, its polished windows reflecting the excitement buzzing in the air. The sign above the entrance gleamed with fresh paint, now proudly reading "The Good Place" in elegant lettering. What was once a place of discrimination and humiliation had been completely transformed into something much greater, a symbol of change and justice. Inside, the scent of fresh bread and sizzling bacon wafted through the air, mingling with the laughter and chatter of a staff that was ready for a new beginning. Shaq stood near the counter, arms crossed, his towering frame radiating confidence as he watched the final preparations. Father James adjusted his sleeves, smiling at the team of new hires, many of whom had once been turned away from this very place. The energy was different now. The hostility that had once clung to these walls was gone, replaced with warmth, acceptance, and purpose. As the doors were unlocked, a flood of people poured in, stretching down the block. Some were there simply for a good meal, while others had followed the viral story and wanted to support the movement Shaq had started. Among the crowd were familiar faces, homeless individuals who had once been treated as nuisances, now greeted as valued guests. One elderly man hesitated at the entrance, his tattered coat hanging loosely over his frail shoulders. A hostess smiled and guided him inside, offering him the best seat in the house. Shaq and Father James moved through the dining area, shaking hands, sharing laughs, and making sure everyone felt welcome. A local news crew had arrived, capturing the scene, eager to broadcast the transformation to the world. Mr. O'Neill, a reporter asked, microphone in hand, you've turned this place upside down in just days. What's the message here? Shaq glanced around, taking in the joy and unity in the room before answering. Simple, he said, voice steady. Food should bring people together, not push them apart. No one should be turned away because of who they are. Applause rippled through the crowd, but Shaq wasn't done. He turned to Father James with a knowing grin. And we're just getting started. The reporter leaned in. What do you mean by that? Shaq's smile widened. This isn't just a restaurant. Once a week, we're feeding the homeless, completely free. No questions, no judgment. A wave of cheers erupted. Staff members beamed, proud to be part of something meaningful. Outside, the line still stretched down the block, a testament to how much people wanted to be part of this moment. But as the celebration continued, an unfamiliar figure lingered near the entrance, hesitant, almost out of place. The energy shifted slightly as some recognized him. It was Richard. The man who had once ruled this restaurant with arrogance and cruelty now stood outside, looking in like an outsider in his own former kingdom. His clothes were no longer crisp, his posture no longer oozing confidence. He hesitated, as if debating whether to step inside. Father James caught sight of him first, his expression unreadable. Then Shaq turned, noticing the figure in the doorway. The celebration hushed for just a moment. Then Shaq spoke, his voice even. Well, well, look who showed up. What does Richard want, and will he be welcome? Months had passed since Richard's humiliating downfall. The once arrogant restaurant manager, who had built his authority on exclusion and cruelty, now found himself on the other side of the very system he once upheld. With no job, no prospects, and a reputation shattered beyond repair, he wandered the streets of the city, seeking any opportunity to reclaim a sliver of his former life. One chilly afternoon, Richard found himself standing in front of a familiar place, the good place. The restaurant he had once controlled with an iron grip had undergone a transformation beyond recognition. The sleek, intimidating atmosphere was now replaced with warmth and vibrance. The once stern staff now greeted guests with genuine smiles, and the aroma of home-cooked meals drifted onto the sidewalk, inviting all who passed. His stomach growled, but that wasn't why he was here. Swallowing his pride, Richard pushed open the door and stepped inside. The sight that greeted him made his throat tighten. Father James stood behind the counter, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and apron, helping a young server with an order. Customers filled every seat, laughter and conversation echoing off the walls. The place wasn't just successful, it was thriving. For a moment, Richard hesitated. He didn't belong here. Not anymore. But desperation outweighed shame, and he took a slow step forward. James looked up and locked eyes with him. The priest's expression didn't hold the satisfaction Richard had expected. Instead, there was something else. Curiosity, pity. Clearing his throat, Richard forced himself to speak. I need a job." His voice was quieter than usual, lacking the smug confidence it once carried. A few customers turned, recognizing him, murmuring amongst themselves. The staff exchanged glances, some in shock, others in amusement. Father James studied him for a long moment, then turned slightly, glancing over his shoulder. Shaq had been watching from across the room, leaning against the wall with his massive arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but there was a weight in his gaze that made Richard's stomach twist. James finally broke the silence, tilting his head. "What do you think, boss? Will Shaq give Richard a second chance, or is this payback time?" For a long, tense moment, the restaurant fell silent. Every eye in the room was locked on Shaq, waiting for his verdict. Richard stood before him, looking nothing like the smug, power-hungry manager he once was. His expensive suits had been replaced with a wrinkled button-down and jeans that had seen better days. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something else. Defeat. Shaq didn't speak right away. He simply stared, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Richard shifted uncomfortably under the intensity of that gaze, his fingers twitching at his sides. He had never felt small before, not even when he was fired in front of the whole restaurant. But now, standing before a man he had once looked down on, the man who now owned his former restaurant, he felt microscopic. "You really came back here looking for a job?" Shaq finally asked, his deep voice steady. Richard cleared his throat. Yeah, I need the work." The room stayed silent. Even the clinking of silverware had stopped. Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Funny, ain't it? A few months ago, you thought you were too good to serve people like Father James. And now, you're asking him for a chance." Richard's face burned with shame. He had no defense, no snappy comeback. He had already lost everything: his job, his reputation, the respect of the people he once controlled. Shaq finally looked over at Father James. "What do you think?" James didn't hesitate. "Everyone deserves a chance to be better." Shaq nodded slowly, then turned back to Richard. "All right, you want to work here? Fine. You can start in the back." Richard blinked. "The back?" Shaq's lips curled into a smirk. "You heard me. Washing dishes." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but quickly shut it. He knew better. He had no leverage, no power, just the chance to survive. He swallowed his pride and gave a small nod. "Okay." Father James placed a hand on Shaq's shoulder, smiling. "You just changed his life, man." Shaq chuckled, watching Richard shuffle toward the kitchen, his head low. "Sometimes," he said with a grin, "the best revenge is making them do the work." Richard thought power made him untouchable, but in the end he learned the hard way. Respect is earned, not taken.